The scream hit every floor of Caldry's syndicate tower like a blade through glass. Not a rival's scream. Not the sound of a threat or an enemy breach. This was something else entirely. Something that cracked through reinforced walls and shook the bones of every guard stationed on every level of the Varello district's most feared building. It was a child's scream. And then it stopped. That silence was worse. Kedron Caldrys reached the penthouse door first. His hand pressed flat against the wood for exactly 1 second before he pushed through. Behind him, Valor moved like a wall of muscle and controlled fury. Rajan entered last, slower, eyes already scanning every corner of the room before his body cleared the threshold. Aron Caldrys, 7 years old, heir to the most dangerous empire in the Varello underworld, lay on the floor beside his bed. His small body jerked in short, violent waves. Foam gathered at the corner of his lips. His eyes had rolled back. The room's private doctor dropped to her knees beside the boy. Her hands moved fast, too fast, like someone who already knew what she was looking at and didn't like it. She looked up at the 3 identical faces staring down at her. One word. Poison. Valor's jaw locked so tight the muscle in his cheek twitched. Kedron didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes stayed on Aron. On the way the boy's fingers curled and uncurled against the carpet. On the foam. On the small chest that kept rising. Keep rising. Keep rising. Keep rising. Rajan turned away from the room and walked directly to the security panel in the hallway. His voice, when he spoke into the comm, came out flat and exact. Lock every floor. No one leaves. Pull all footage from the last 6 hours. Now. 3 minutes later, the security feed was live. The control room on the 42nd floor filled with guards crowding behind 2 lead analysts. The footage moved in real time. Kitchen staff, delivery logs, shift workers, until one analyst tapped the screen and froze a frame from the lobby feed, timestamped 8:47 p.m. There. Thin frame. Dark clothing. Barefoot on the cold lobby tile. Moving close to the wall like someone who had learned a long time ago that walls don't hit back. The figure's head stayed down. No eye contact. No hesitation. Just quiet, deliberate movement toward the service corridor. An omega. The analysts pulled secondary angles. The figure appeared on 4 separate cameras before disappearing into a blind spot near the east stairwell. Then nothing. Then, 40 minutes later, chaos near the penthouse level. Security had already pulled him from the stairwell by then. Already had him in cuffs before he could form a single gesture of explanation. He hadn't fought them. That was the detail one guard kept repeating when asked. He hadn't fought at all. The basement holding level smelled like old concrete and recycled air. Cell Block C sat at the far end of a corridor where the overhead light buzzed and flickered in a pattern that felt intentional. Like it was designed to break something in a person over time. Soren Vale sat with his back against the cell wall, wrists in chains, both knees pulled to his chest. His left cheekbone had started to swell where a guard's elbow caught him during the takedown. His feet, still bare, pressed flat against the floor as if even now he was trying to find something solid to hold onto. He wasn't shaking because of the cold. He was shaking because he had watched the guards drag him away from the penthouse floor before he could find out if the boy made it. That was the only thing in his head right now. Not the chains. Not the swollen cheek. Not what was going to happen to him in the morning. Just the child. Just Aron. Soren pressed his forehead to his knees and closed his eyes. He ran the moment back the way he had run it back 100 times already since they threw him in here. The dining room. The tray. The bodyguard near the drink station who thought no one was watching. The small vial. The practiced, casual motion of a man who had done this before. Soren had moved without thinking. He always moved without thinking when it came to children. That had never once worked out in his favor. The elevator at the end of the corridor groaned to life. Soren lifted his head. The hum of the cables. The mechanical slide of the doors. And then footsteps. 3 sets. Identical rhythm. Identical weight. moving in a formation that didn't need to be coordinated because it never had to be practiced. The buzzing overhead light caught them at the end of the corridor. 3 faces. The same face. 3 pairs of eyes that held no warmth, no confusion, and no mercy. Hi, viewers. If you woke up one morning and had no voice, no way to speak, and the most powerful and dangerous men in the city believed you had just tried to kill a child, what would you do? The Triplet Kings stopped outside the cell door, and the way the tallest one, Kedron, looked at Soren through the bars made the Omega understand something cold and precise. They had already made a decision. They were only here to look at him first. The interrogation room on the 41st floor had no windows. That was intentional. Kedron had designed this room himself years ago because windows gave people something to look at when they didn't want to answer a question. This room gave them nothing. For walls, 1 table. For chairs, a single overhead light that threw sharp shadows and left no soft edges anywhere. Soren Vale sat in the center chair with his wrists still bound in front of him. 2 guards stood at the door. Another positioned himself directly behind the Omega, close enough that Soren could feel the heat coming off the man's jacket. The triplets entered together and stopped. All 3 of them stopped at the same moment, at the same distance from the table without any signal passing between them. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't hesitation. Something in the air changed the moment they crossed the threshold. Kedron's nostrils flared. He felt it hit the back of his throat first. Warm, quiet, layered, like something pulled from a memory he hadn't made yet. His instincts spiked so fast his hand moved to the chair back in front of him before he registered the motion. Valor went still in a way that had nothing to do with discipline. His eyes moved to the Omega at the table and didn't move again. The muscle at the base of his jaw tightened and held. Rajan stood in the doorway 1 beat longer than his brothers, then stepped inside slowly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes said the same thing the other 2 were already feeling and refusing to name. Mate. The scent was soft. Undeniable. The kind of thing alpha instinct doesn't misread, doesn't rationalize, doesn't talk itself out of. And it was coming from the trembling Omega chained to the chair in front of them. Kedron pulled out the chair across from Soren and sat down. He placed both hands flat on the table. His voice came out measured, cold. Exactly the way it always came out in rooms like this. You were in this building tonight without authorization. You were found near the penthouse level at the same time my son was poisoned. A pause. Short. Heavy. Explain yourself. Soren looked at him. Then Soren opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Not because he chose silence. Not because he was calculating an answer. His throat worked, visibly, desperately, and produced nothing. His eyes filled so fast it looked involuntary, like pressure finding the only exit it could. He lifted his chained hands and tried to gesture. Both hands moving, pointing, sketching shapes in the air, the way someone does when their hands have been their voice for so long the motion is instinct. Valor's chair scraped the floor as he stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Stop. The word came out like a wall. If you can't speak, write it down. A guard set a notepad and pen on the table. Soren's hands shook as he reached for the pen. He got it between his fingers, tried to steady. The first word came out jagged, pressed too hard into the paper bodyguard, and then the pen skidded as his hands gave out entirely from the trembling. He tried again. The letters blurred in front of him. Valor watched the paper. His face didn't soften, but something shifted behind his eyes. Just for a moment. Something he would not have named out loud. Rajan moved for the first time since entering the room. He walked around the table slowly and stood at the side, looking down at the notepad, looking at the shaking hands, looking at the Omega who was trying so hard to communicate something that his whole body was fighting itself. He said nothing. Kedron studied the Omega's face. He was trained to read faces, trained to separate the performance of fear from the reality of it. The performance had tells. Careful eyes, controlled breathing, the tiny pause before an expression arrived. This was not a performance. This was a person unraveling in real time, completely unable to stop it. That didn't prove innocence, but it was something. Take him back to holding, Kedron said quietly. The guards moved forward. Soren's head snapped up. His eyes found Kedron's across the table, wide, urgent, full of something that looked exactly like a man watching the last door close before he could reach it. He shook his head. Hard. Once. Kedron looked at him for one long moment. Then he looked away. They filed out of the room in the same order they entered. The door closed behind them. In the corridor, none of the three spoke immediately. The silence between them held a specific kind of weight. The kind that comes when three people share a thought none of them are willing to say first. Valor finally stopped walking. He didn't turn around. He just stopped, one hand pressed against the corridor wall, his back to his brothers. The scent from that room was still in his chest. Soft, warm, persistent. Mate, he pressed his palm harder against the wall. Because the Omega they had just locked away until morning, the one they were almost certain had poisoned their son, was the same one every alpha instinct in Valor's body was screaming at him to go back and stand in front of. To shield. To keep. He pushed off the wall and kept walking. But the feeling didn't leave. None of them said it, but all three of them felt it every step of the way back to the elevator. Like something being pulled away from them. And the terrifying part? It got stronger the further they walked. Earlier that evening, at 7:52 p.m., Soren Vale had stepped through the service entrance of Cauldry's Syndicate Tower carrying a mop bucket, a folded cleaning cloth, and nothing else. He had worked 3 shifts in the building before this one. Always the same floors. Always the service corridors. Always with his head down, his body quiet. His presence small enough that the guards never found reason to look twice. That was the skill Soren had spent years perfecting. Invisibility. In Mafia-controlled territory, and Omega's survival had almost nothing to do with strength. It had everything to do with being forgettable. He had learned that before he learned to read. He moved through rooms the way most people moved through doorways. Quickly, without leaving a mark, without drawing the kind of attention that followed you home. Tonight he was assigned to the 44th floor kitchen prep area and the adjacent dining corridor. Routine work. The kind of job where his hands moved automatically and his mind stayed quiet and the hours passed without event. He was wiping down the far counter when he heard the bodyguard come in. Not unusual. Guards passed through the service areas constantly. Soren didn't look up. But something made him slow down. Not a sound. Not a word. Something in the movement, the deliberate, careful placement of steps that didn't match the lazy rotation of a guard doing rounds. Someone who needed to not be noticed. Someone who had learned, the same way Soren had learned, how to move through a space and leave no impression. Soren's cloth stopped moving. He kept his head angled down. His eyes moved up, slowly, beneath the fall of his hair. The guard stood near the drink station at the far end of the counter. One hand rested on the tray. The other hand came up from his jacket pocket. 2 fingers precise, and Soren caught the shape of a small vial pressed between them. The man's body angled just enough to block the camera line. He'd scoped that angle before he came in here. The drop was fast, almost invisible, into the glass at the center of the tray. The glass with the blue rim that the kitchen staff had already explained, twice this week, was for the young heir who had specific preferences about his dishware. Aron's glass. Soren moved before the thought finished forming. He didn't have a plan. He never had a plan in moments like this. His body just went low, fast, cutting across the kitchen floor with his shoulder angled forward. The bodyguard heard him coming and turned just as Soren reached the counter. The collision wasn't clean. Soren's arm caught the tray at the wrong angle. The glass tipped. The bodyguard grabbed for it. Soren's palm hit the base of the drink and knocked it sideways. Liquid splashing across the counter, across the tray, pooling fast into the cloth he had left sitting beside it. most of it soaked into the fabric. Most of it, not all. The bodyguard hit him once, hard in the left side. A short punch meant to look like a reflex, like a guard reacting to an intruder. Then he stepped back and started shouting. Loud. Commanding. The voice of someone who had already constructed the next 5 minutes before they happened. Security came in 40 seconds. They saw an Omega pressed against the counter, a toppled tray, a spilled drink, and a guard pointing. They did not ask questions. Soren hit the floor when they tackled him, and he didn't fight back because fighting back had never once helped him in any situation in his entire life. He went still. He let them bind his wrists. He let them drag him toward the stairwell. He did not take his eyes off the kitchen doorway until they pulled him through it. Because somewhere above him, on another floor, a child was about to drink from a glass that hadn't been fully emptied. And Soren had done everything he could. He just didn't know if it was enough. Back in the present, in the medical suite on the 45th floor, the lead doctor stood over Arin's bed with her tablet pressed against her chest and a look on her face that she was trying to keep professional. She was not fully succeeding. She turned to the attending nurse and spoke low, like the words needed to be tested before they were said out loud. The toxin profile doesn't match the exposure volume. She shook her head once. At the concentration this compound should have been administered, given Arin's body weight, cardiac arrest would have occurred within 8 minutes of ingestion. She looked back at the boy, at the small chest rising and falling with the help of the oxygen line. The dose was diluted, significantly, by at least 60 to 70%. The nurse looked up. Diluted how? The glass was still. I don't know how. The doctor's voice stayed flat. But something reduced the concentration before he drank it. She set the tablet down. If it hadn't been diluted, we would not be treating a sick child right now. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. 3 floors below, in cell block C, Soren Vale sat with his forehead pressed to his knees and his chained wrists resting against the cold floor. He didn't know what the doctor had just said. He didn't know the boy was still breathing. He only knew the silence that comes after a door closes on the only chance you had to explain yourself. And somewhere in that silence, the elevator cables groaned again. But this time, the direction was different. Someone was heading down to the control room, and they were pulling security footage. The Cauldry's security control room ran 24-hour ops on a rotating team of 6 analysts. Tonight all 6 were at their stations, and the head of tower security. Deshaun Morrow, 17 years with the Cauldry's syndicate, the kind of man who had learned to move fast without ever looking rushed, stood at the center console with his arms crossed and his eyes on the main screen. Start at 7:45, he said. Kitchen corridor. East angle. The footage rolled. It looked at first like nothing. Service staff. Movement. The ordinary background noise of a working floor in a building this size. Deshaun watched without expression. Then the bodyguard entered the frame. Deshaun's jaw shifted. He didn't say anything. He watched the man's hands. The precise angle of the body near the drink station. The way the jacket pocket moved. The brief moment where something small passed between 2 fingers. Pause. The analyst froze the frame. Deshaun leaned forward. Close. His breath fogged slightly against the glass of the monitor. Back 12 seconds. Slow. The footage reversed. Then moved forward again at half speed. The motion was clear now, deliberate, practiced, hidden behind a body angle that had been scouted in advance. Deshaun's eyes moved to the next camera angle. The one that caught the Omega entering the frame from the far corridor. Keep it slow. Frame by frame. The Omega's movements resolved into something entirely different from what the initial report had described. He wasn't running toward the drink station. He wasn't grabbing. He was reaching, arm extended, body low, toward the base of the glass, toward the tray, trying to intercept it without causing chaos, without drawing the kind of attention that would tip the real threat off before the glass could be secured. The collision happened in slow motion on the screen. The tray tilted. The glass went sideways. Liquid spread fast across the cloth on the counter. Most of it absorbed immediately. Deshawn straightened up. The control room was very quiet. One of the junior analysts, a woman named Taya who had been with the team for 8 months, said, softly and without looking away from her own monitor. He was trying to stop it. No one answered her, because they had all just watched the same footage. Deshawn picked up the comm unit. His voice came out even, controlled. The voice of someone delivering information they know will be received like a strike. I need the 3 kings in the control room. Now. They arrived in 4 minutes. Kedron entered first. He positioned himself directly in front of the main screen without being directed to it. Valor took the left side of the room. Rajan moved to the corner where he could see both the screen and every person in the space simultaneously. Deshawn played the footage without preamble. No narration. No explanation. He let the footage speak. The first pass was normal speed. The second pass was half speed. The third was frame by frame, with Deshawn pointing in silence at each key moment. The bodyguard's hands, the vial, the angle of the body near the camera line, and then the Omega entering the frame and moving to intercept the glass before it could reach the child. Kedron did not move during any of the 3 passes. His eyes stayed on the screen. His hands rested at his sides. The only thing that changed was something around his mouth. A tightening, slight, controlled, the expression of a man forcing himself to process something he would rather refuse. Valor watched the screen with his arms crossed and his jaw locked. When the footage ended the 3rd time, he turned away from the monitor and faced the wall. Just for a moment. His chest felt like something heavy had been placed directly in the center of it and hadn't moved. Rajan, in the corner, spoke for the first time since they entered. He didn't poison Aaron. The words sat in the room with all the weight of something that didn't need to be argued. Just acknowledged. Kedron turned from the screen slowly. He saved him, Kedron said. Not a question. A recalibration. The room stayed quiet. Because in the Cauldries Syndicate, these men did not make mistakes like this. They were not the kind of rulers who acted on incomplete information and locked innocent people in basement cells. That was not the story they told about themselves. And here, right now, the footage made clear that the story needed revision. They had put the person who saved Aaron's life in chains. Kedron looked at Deshawn. Deshawn understood the look. He was already queuing up the secondary feeds. The corridor camera near the service entrance, the stairwell angle, the lobby footage, pulling every frame the real threat had appeared in. He was building the file on the bodyguard. But across the room, one of the overnight analysts, stationed at the secondary monitor bank in the far corner, had gone very still. Her hand hovered over her keyboard without touching it. Her eyes moved from the screen to the door and back to the screen. She had been watching the footage too. Not the kitchen corridor footage. The basement feed. The live feed. She saw the mute Omega in cell block C. Saw the chains. Saw the swollen face. And now she knew, from the footage on the main screen, exactly what that Omega had done to earn those chains. She leaned back from her keyboard slowly. Her face stayed neutral, careful. The practiced expression of someone controlling what they showed to a room full of people who watched faces for a living. She reached into her jacket pocket and felt the shape of her personal phone. The bodyguard who had poisoned the drink was already gone from the tower. But someone had told him when to move. Someone had provided access. Someone had known the air schedule, his preferences, his dishware, the exact camera blind spots on the 44th floor. That someone was still here. And they had just watched the same footage the Triplet Kings had watched. Which meant they now knew one critical thing. The Omega in the basement had survived. He was alive. And he had seen the bodyguard's face. The basement door hit the wall when it opened. Not pushed, thrown. The kind of force that comes from a person who has been moving toward a destination since before they left the room they started in and has not slowed down once. Footsteps followed. Sharp. Echoing. 3 sets moving in a line down the corridor toward cell block C, and the quality of that sound was different from the last time. Last time it was judgment walking toward a verdict. This time it was something rawer. Something that didn't have a clean name yet. Soren heard them coming. He raised his head from his knees slowly. His eyes moved to the corridor end, to the place where the flickering overhead light caught them as they turned the corner. Kedron, Valor, Rajan. The same three faces. But the faces had changed. Kedron stopped in front of the cell door. He stood there for a moment looking through the bars at the Omega, at the swollen cheek, the bare feet, the chains, the dried track marks from tears that had long since stopped because the body sometimes runs out of the energy it takes to keep producing them. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a key. No guards behind him, no procedural posture, no performance of authority. Just a man standing in front of a cell door with a key in his hand and an expression that held something Soren had never once seen directed at himself in his entire life. Something that looked like shame. The lock disengaged. The door swung inward. Kedron stepped across the threshold and crouched down. Actually crouched, lowered himself fully to eye level with the Omega sitting on the floor. And the motion was so unexpected that Soren pressed back against the wall before he could stop himself. Kedron didn't move closer. He just stayed there, level, still. His voice came out lower than Soren had heard it before, stripped of the cold control it had carried in the interrogation room. You were trying to stop it. He paused. Weren't you? Not a question this time either. Soren looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. One slow, exhausted movement of his head. And something in Kedron's face cracked open in a way that his face was not designed to do in front of other people. He held it, then breathed out through his nose and reached forward carefully and unlatched the chain at Soren's wrists. The metal fell away. Soren looked down at his own hands, turned them over once. His wrists were raw where the cuffs had pressed. He just looked at them like he hadn't seen his own hands in a while. Valor stood in the doorway of the cell. His arms weren't crossed this time. They hung at his sides in the posture of a man who doesn't know what to do with his hands when the thing driving him has nowhere left to go. He looked at the Omega on the floor and something moved through his expression. Fast, complicated, layered. The air in the cell shifted. It was the same thing from the interrogation room. That scent. Soft and warm and persistent. The kind of thing that doesn't weaken with distance or time, only intensifies when you get closer to the source. All three of them felt it hit differently in this enclosed space. Not a suggestion this time, a certainty. Rajan had moved to the far side of the cell without Soren noticing him enter. He stood near the wall, quiet as always, watching. His eyes moved between the Omega's face and his brother's. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Valor stepped further into the cell. He crouched down to match his brother's position, closer to Soren than was strictly necessary, and when he spoke his voice had dropped to something low and private, like a confession made to a room of 3 people instead of 1. We watched the footage. He stopped, started again. We almost... He pressed his mouth closed. His jaw moved once. We almost let you die in here. Soren looked at him. Valor looked back. And the pull in the room. That unnamed, undeniable weight between an Omega and 3 Alphas whose instincts had been shouting the same word since the moment they first entered the interrogation room. Pressed against all 4 of them like a hand on the chest. Mate, the realization lived behind Valor's eyes clearly now. Not with awe, with something closer to controlled horror at what they had nearly done to their own mate. Soren didn't understand the full force of what they were feeling, but he felt something shift. The threat had left the air. Something else had moved in, protective, dense, surrounding, and his Omega instincts were reading it the way they read all things. Carefully, quietly, with the long memory of every time safety had turned out to be a door that locked from the outside. He was still pressed against the wall, but he had stopped shaking. Kedron straightened up and looked at his brothers. One look, 3 men, an entire conversation that moved without words. Then, from the floor above, the sound hit them. Gunfire. Not distant. Not muffled. Close enough that the ceiling vibrated and the overhead light swung once on its fixture. A shout came through Rajan's comm. Clipped, urgent, already mid-sentence. Medical wing. They've breached the east corridor, the child's room. Rajan was already moving. Vaylor was on his feet. Kedron turned back to Soren, just for a moment, 1 second, and the look on his face carried something absolute. Not a command. Promise. Then all three of them were gone, and the boots echoed back down the corridor at a dead run. And Soren sat in the open cell with his unchained hands in his lap and the distant sound of chaos pouring through the ceiling above him. And in the part of his mind that had already run the numbers on this moment, on the vial, on the glass, on the poison that had been meant to work instantly, one thought surfaced cold and clear. The poison was supposed to kill immediately. It hadn't, which meant the person who ordered it had known it might fail, which meant they had a backup, and the backup had just started. The explosion hit before the echo of the gunshots finished moving through the walls. Not a full detonation. A charge. Surgical. The kind placed by someone who knew exactly how much force it took to blow a specific door off a specific frame without collapsing the ceiling above it. Which meant whoever did this had been inside the medical wing before tonight. Had walked those corridors. Had counted the steps between the entrance and the heirs' room. This was not improvised. This was the second phase of a plan that had started long before the poison. Soren was on his feet before he made the decision to stand. His bare feet hit the cold basement floor and he moved to the open cell door, one hand on the frame, listening. The comm chatter was still coming through the unit Rajan had left on the small table outside the cell in his rush to move. Not intentionally left, just dropped in the speed of the moment. Soren picked it up. He couldn't speak into it, but he could listen. East corridor is sealed. They can't get to the stairwell. The doctor is inside the room. The child is connected to monitors. We have 3 down on level 45. 3 guards down. Soren pressed his back against the wall and ran the numbers again the way he had been running them since they threw him in the cell. The poison had been diluted. The attacker knew the first attempt had failed, or had always planned for it to fail, which meant the heir dying from poison was never the actual goal. The goal was chaos. The poison was the distraction. Something else was the target. He pressed the comm against his chest and thought hard. The bodyguard near the drink station had moved with the practiced ease of someone who had done dry runs. The camera blind spots on the 44th floor weren't accidental. Someone had mapped them. The vial had been precise, a specific compound, a specific dosage, a specific glass. That required inside information, not just access. Loyalty. Someone inside the tower had handed over every detail needed to make this happen. Floor plans, schedules, security rotations, the heir's routine, the medical wing layout. And now that someone knew the Omega in the basement had seen the bodyguard's face. Another burst of static from the comm. Explosion confirmed in the 45th floor medical corridor. Fire suppression activated. We cannot confirm the heir's status. Soren's jaw tightened. He looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at the stairwell door at the end of the corridor. Every rational part of him said stay. Stay in the basement. Stay in the cell where the Triplet Kings left him. Stay invisible. That was the rule that kept Omegas alive in places like this. Invisible. Small. Quiet. But Aaron was up there. And Soren had already broken every rule he owned once tonight, and the boy was still breathing because of it. He moved to the stairwell. On the 45th floor, the medical corridor was thick with smoke and suppression foam, and the acrid sting of a precision charge discharged in an enclosed space. Vaylor had 2 guards down in front of him and a third retreating around the far corner. He moved through the corridor with the specific economy of a man who had stopped thinking and started operating. Threats processed and neutralized before they finished forming. But the heir's room door was still closed, and no one on his side could reach it yet. Kedron was at the stairwell entrance, coordinating the secondary team coming up from 43. He had his comm in one hand and his eyes on every angle of the corridor simultaneously. His mind was working the problem in layers. Perimeter, access points, the medical team inside the room, the fire suppression system, the third guard who had gone around the far corner. 3 guards down. 1 unaccounted for. And the east stairwell door, the one on the far side of the corridor, was still closed. Rajan was already watching it. He stood perfectly still in the smoke and didn't take his eyes off that door. Because the attacker had come through the west entrance and moved east. Which meant either the east stairwell was an exit route, or a second entry point. The door moved, just slightly. Rajan's hand went to his side. The door pushed open and Soren Vale stepped through it, barefoot, carrying the comm unit. His eyes moving immediately to the heirs room, reading the smoke, reading the foam on the floor, reading the 3 down guards and the positions of the alphas in the corridor with the speed of someone whose survival had always depended on reading rooms faster than other people. His eyes found Rajan. He held up the comm. Then he pointed back through the east stairwell door. Down. Specific direction. Specific floor. His other hand opened flat, fingers spread, then 2 fingers folded. 3 fingers left. 3rd floor. Rajan looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then he spoke into his own comm without looking away from Soren's face. Check sublevel 3. Now. Full team. Kedron turned. Saw Soren in the doorway. His expression moved through 3 things in about half a second. Relief, confusion, and something sharper that settled into focus. He crossed the corridor in 4 strides. How do you know? Soren couldn't answer that in words. He pointed to the comm unit he'd picked up, then made a motion, hand flat, moving steady, calm, the gesture for something rehearsed, planned in advance. Then he pointed to the door of the heirs room and held up 1 finger. 1 person is still inside. Not a doctor. Kedron's eyes went to the door, then back to Soren. Then he moved. Valor was already at the door. The lock disengaged from the inside when Kedron's override code hit the panel and they went through together. And the scene inside stopped both of them for exactly 1 breath. The doctor was on the floor, conscious, zip tie on her wrists, not badly hurt. Aaron was in the bed, still connected to the monitors. Monitors still showing a pulse. And the window on the far wall, 4th floor exterior, the one that shouldn't open, was open. The attacker had already left. But Aaron was still there, still breathing. Valor stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his son. At the small chest rising and falling under the thin hospital blanket, and something moved through him that was not a feeling he knew how to carry in his body. Too large, too raw. The kind of thing that made powerful men feel like the ground under them isn't as solid as they always believed. From the corridor, Rajan's voice came through the comm. Sublevel 3. We have movement. Kedron was already moving back to the door. He stopped at the threshold and looked back. Not at his brothers. At the east stairwell. At the place where a barefoot, mute Omega had just walked through fire suppression foam and smoke to point them in the right direction. Soren was still standing in the corridor. And for the first time in this building, no one was pointing a weapon at him. That matters. Because the only person in the tower who had correctly read the threat, both times in a single night, was the one they had put in chains. The mate bond doesn't care about timing. That's the part the Cauldry's triplets had never had to account for, because they had never felt it before. They had read about it, had heard the older syndicate families describe it in terms that sounded like mythology, like something that happened to other people in other circumstances, not to 3 alpha kings who had built their empire on control and calculation. But the bond doesn't negotiate. It arrives, and danger accelerates it. Soren felt it for the first time not as warmth, as pressure, a change in the air around him when all 3 triplets were in the same space, a density that his Omega instincts recognized before his conscious mind had a name for it. Protective, enclosing, the specific feeling of being inside something rather than exposed to everything. He had never felt that before. He didn't entirely trust it, but his body was responding to it in ways he couldn't override. They moved him to the secure suite on the 38th floor, away from the medical wing, away from the smoke, away from the open window on 45. 2 guards outside the door. No chains this time. A medical kit on the table. Someone had thought to bring socks. Small thing. It hit Soren harder than it should have. Kedron entered the room first. He set a notepad and a good pen on the table in front of Soren. Not a guard's notepad, a proper one, and pulled a chair to the opposite side without sitting in it. Then he looked at the Omega directly. We need to know who you saw. In the kitchen. The one who put the compound in the glass. He paused. I know you can't speak. Draw it if you can. Soren looked at the notepad. His hands were steadier now than they'd been in hours. The shaking had moved from his fingers to somewhere deeper inside. The kind of tremor that doesn't show on the surface but lives in the chest and the stomach and behind the knees. He picked up the pen. He drew fast. Not artistic. Functional. The way someone draws when the image is burned into their memory and they just need to get it out of their head and onto the paper before it shifts. The face took shape in less than 90 seconds. Strong jaw. Close-cut hair at the temples. A scar thin, diagonal across the left eyebrow. Wide-set eyes. A specific way the nose had been broken and set slightly off-center that Soren had noticed because he noticed those things because noticing kept him alive. He pushed the paper across the table. Kedron looked at it. Didn't move. Vaylor, standing near the window, pushed off the wall and crossed the room to look over his brother's shoulder. The air went out of the room. Rajan, who had been leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed and his eyes on the ceiling, dropped his gaze to the paper. Then to his brothers. Vaylor picked up the notepad, held it closer, like the proximity would change what he was seeing. Didn't. That's Devlin Ashworth, Vaylor said. The name sat in the room like something dropped from a height. Devlin Ashworth. 14 years inside the Cauldries Syndicate. Combat Commander. Tier 1 clearance. The man who had trained half the current security team. The man who sat 3 chairs to Kedron's left at the operations table and had done so for over a decade. Not an outsider. Not a rival. Family. Soren watched the 3 of them and felt the shift happen in real time. The specific texture of shock moving through powerful men who are not accustomed to being caught off guard. The way their bodies stiffened and then went carefully, deliberately still. The way the air in the room changed temperature. He had drawn one face. That face had just broken something open inside this tower that a bomb couldn't have reached. Rajan spoke first. And when he spoke, it was quiet. The quietest voice in the room, which on Rajan meant the most dangerous thing currently being said. He knows every entry point, every rotation, every protocol. Vaylor set the notepad back on the table. He trained the people chasing him. Kedron looked at the drawing one more time. Then he stood up. His voice came out the way it always came out when a decision had already been made and the only thing left was execution. Find him. He turned toward the door, then stopped. He looked back at Soren, at the Omega sitting at the table with the pen still in his hand and the drawing between them. And something moved across Kedron's face that was not strategist, not ruler, something older than either of those. You stay in this room, he said. Guards outside. No one enters without my authorization. Soren looked at him. Kedron held the look for a moment longer than necessary. Then he was gone, and both brothers were gone with him, and Soren sat alone in the room with the drawing and the socks and the understanding that the man he had just identified, the man who had tried to kill a 7-year-old child, had trained everyone who was now responsible for catching him. And somewhere in the walls of the same tower, Devlin Ashworth was already moving. Devlin Ashworth made it to the rooftop helipad in 11 minutes. Fast, but not fast enough. Because Rajan had studied the tower's exit architecture the same way Devlin had, and Rajan had started from a position Devlin hadn't accounted for. The man had planned for the Cauldries triplets to be grieving fathers tonight. Distracted. fracturing under the weight of a poisoned child and a dead heir. He had not planned for the heir to survive. He had not planned for an Omega with a perfect memory. The rooftop was wide and flat and exposed under the Varello district night sky. The city spread out below in a grid of orange light and shadow. The helicopter was already warming up. Blades turning slow, the pilot at the controls, the side door open and waiting. Devlin crossed the pad in long strides. He didn't look back. That was the tell. Experienced men always looked back. He was already rattled. Vaylor came through the rooftop access door first. He didn't run. There was nowhere for Devlin to go that was faster than a helicopter, and Vaylor knew it, and he let that knowledge settle his pace into something controlled and purposeful and deeply unhurried, which was somehow more threatening than running. Devlin stopped 10 feet from the helicopter door. He turned. His face was composed. Almost. The scar across his left eyebrow caught the rooftop lighting exactly the way Soren had seen it catch the kitchen light on the 44th floor. The off-center nose. The wide-set eyes. Same face. Exactly as drawn. Kedron and Rajan came through the access door behind Vaylor. 3 of them. Devlin looked at the helicopter. Looked at the 3 men between him and it. Did the math. 14 years, Kedron said. He stopped 15 feet from Devlin. His hands were at his sides. His voice was the flat, exact voice of a man who has already processed his anger and is now on the other side of it, which is a much more dangerous place to be. 14 years at this table. Every decision we made, you were in that room. Devlin's jaw shifted. You built an empire on a model that was going to fail, he said. I was accelerating the inevitable. By poisoning a child. By removing an heir before he could become a king in a dynasty that shouldn't exist. Vaylor took 1 step forward. Devlin held up a hand. He reached into his jacket slowly. Deliberate, controlled, the motion of someone who knew how to keep a conversation from ending before he was ready. He pulled out a phone. I want you to think carefully before this ends, he said. Because the person who funded this operation is not in this building. They are watching everything that happens on this rooftop right now. And if I don't make a call in the next 4 minutes, information goes to every syndicate council member in the Varello district. Information about accounts. Operations. Supply lines. He paused. Everything. Rajan watched the phone. Then he watched Devlin's face. He had learned over a very long time to separate the performance of confidence from the reality of it. The words were right. The construction was solid. The threat was real. But Devlin's left hand was shaking. Just slightly. He had not expected to be on this rooftop in a conversation. He had expected to be in the air. Kedron looked at the phone. Then at Devlin. His voice came out softer than any of the previous words, which in Kedron's register was the signal that something had ended. Make the call, he said. Devlin blinked. We already pulled your files, Kedron continued. 2 hours ago while you were setting charges. Every account number. Every contact. Every communication you've run through this tower in the past 14 years. A pause. Your leverage disappeared before you reached the rooftop. The phone in Devlin's hand looked suddenly very small. The blades on the helicopter had slowed. The pilot was no longer at the controls. Devlin looked at the helicopter. Vaylor. Kedron. At Rajan, who had not moved or spoken and whose stillness was the kind that arrived right before something final. The composure left his face all at once. And what was underneath it was not rage. It was fear. The genuine kind. He took a step back. Hit the edge of the helipad railing. Looked down at the city below. 38 floors of Varello district night air. Then back at the 3 men in front of him. He talked. Fast. The way people talk when they understand that information is the only thing between them and a drop they won't survive. The funding. The timeline. The contact. The original plan. All of it came out in a rush. Names, dates, a council member, a syndicate rival who had been quietly building toward this for 3 years, using Devlin as the instrument, a man who had accepted the access and the payments and told himself it was inevitable and not treason. Kedron listened to every word. When Devlin finished, the rooftop was quiet except for the city below and the slowing rotation of the helicopter blades. Devlin pressed his back against the railing. "I told you everything," he said. "You did," Kedron agreed. A pause. Short. Then Devlin's legs gave and the guards who had come up behind him through the second access door caught him before he hit the ground, and the rest of it moved with the quiet, practiced efficiency of a syndicate that had been handling its own justice for 3 generations. The helicopter blades stopped. The rooftop cleared. And in the secure suite on the 38th floor, Soren Vale sat at the table with the drawing still in front of him and did not know that the face he had sketched from memory had just confessed on a rooftop under the Varello night sky. He only knew that the tower had gone quiet. And quiet in a building like this was either the best thing or the worst thing. He was still waiting to find out which. Aaron Caldries opened his eyes at 4:17 in the morning. He blinked at the ceiling of the medical suite, at the clean white panels, at the 4-line running from his small arm to the stand beside the bed, at the monitors that had been beeping steadily for hours, and then he turned his head. The first person he saw was Soren. Not one of his fathers. Not the doctor. Not a guard. Soren Vale, sitting in a chair pulled close to the bed, still in the cleaning staff uniform he had worn when he walked through the service entrance almost 9 hours ago. Still barefoot inside a pair of borrowed socks. His head had dropped to one side with the posture of someone who had fought sleep for a long time and finally lost. Aaron looked at him for a moment. Then he reached out and touched the back of Soren's hand with 2 fingers. Soren woke up the way people wake up when they've learned to come awake fast and quiet. No sound. No disorientation. He just came up from sleep into full awareness and found Aaron looking at him with the calm, direct eyes of a child who had not yet learned to be ashamed of curiosity. "You were there," Aaron said. His voice was rough from the oxygen line, but clear. Soren looked at him, nodded once. Aaron considered this. "You caught the glass." Another nod. The boy's brow furrowed slightly, not upset. Working something out. Then it cleared. "He saved me," Aaron said. Not to Soren. To the room. Because all 3 of his fathers were in the room. They had been there for an hour, ranged across the space in their specific configurations. Kedron in the chair nearest the door, Valer standing at the window, Rajan in the far corner. None of them had been sleeping. Aaron's voice, saying those 3 words, landed in the room like a stone into still water. Kedron looked at his son, then at Soren. Valer turned from the window. Aaron, satisfied with the answer he had arrived at on his own, shifted carefully in the bed and looked at Soren again. He said, with the total confidence of a 7-year-old who has decided something and is not open to revision, "You're staying." Soren's expression moved. Something that was not quite a smile and was more than a shift. His eyes went soft at the corners in the way that happens when emotion finds the only exit a person's face will allow. He looked at Kedron. Kedron held his gaze. Then Kedron stood up from his chair and walked to the center of the room. He didn't stop at the medical suite's intercom. He picked up the tower-wide comm instead, the one that reached every floor, every guard station, every hall in the building, and he pressed the broadcast. When he spoke, his voice carried the specific weight of a public declaration inside an organization where words like this were not used casually and were never, once spoken, walked back. Soren Vale is under direct Caldries protection. Permanent. Unconditional. Any person inside or outside the syndicate who directs harm toward him answers to all 3 of us. He set the comm down. The suite was very quiet. Valer moved away from the window. He crossed the room and stopped in front of Soren, close, but not in the imposing way he had stood in the interrogation room 12 hours ago. Different now. The way someone stands when they are in front of something they are afraid of losing. The mate bond had been building since the moment they first walked into that interrogation room and stopped. Since the moment the scent hit them and logic told them to ignore it. It had built through the basement cell and the footage and the rooftop and all the hours in between where none of them had said the word out loud. Vaylor said it now. Not the word itself. What the word meant. "You're not our prisoner," he said. "You were never going to leave here as our prisoner." His voice was low, private, directed only at the Omega sitting in the chair beside his son's bed. "But you are ours." Soren looked at him, then at Kedron, then at Rajan, who had moved from the corner without sound and stood now at the edge of the small circle the three alphas had formed. Not around Soren like a cage, but between Soren and everything else in the world that wasn't this room. The bond hit Soren the way all certain things hit people who have spent their whole life being uncertain. All at once, he pressed his lips together. His eyes filled. He let them. He had spent years making himself invisible. Years reading rooms to survive. Years calculating exits before he walked through entrances. He had never once, in all of that, expected to end up at the center of something instead of at the edge of it. He reached out and placed one hand over Vaylor's. The room. The medical suite of the most feared tower in Varello, with a recovering air in the bed and three Alpha Kings standing in a circle and the quiet hum of monitors and the distant sound of the city 45 floors below. Felt, for just a moment, like something that could hold all of it. Then Aaron, from the bed, said, "Does this mean you'll be at breakfast?" And Vaylor laughed. It was the kind of laugh that surprises the person it comes from. Short, real. The sound of a very controlled man being caught off guard by something genuine. Kedron looked at his son. His expression, for the first time since the scream that started all of this, was not managing anything. It was just a father looking at his living child. And somewhere far from the Varello district, in a council chamber that hadn't yet learned how the night had ended, a syndicate leader was waiting for a report that was never going to come. The Cauldry's tower was still standing. The air was alive, and the man sent to destroy the dynasty had given up every name on that rooftop. Every name. 3 weeks later, the Cauldry's syndicate tower was a different building. Same walls, same floors, same guards at the same stations. But the air moved differently through it now. Quieter in some places, louder in others. Like a place that had been holding its breath for a long time and had finally, cautiously, let it go. Aaron recovered faster than the doctors expected. The medical team attributed it to the dilution, to the 60-something% reduction in the compound's concentration that had bought the boy enough time for treatment to work. They wrote it in their reports that way. Clinical, precise. But everyone in the tower knew what it actually was. It was a barefoot Omega who moved before he thought. The dining room on the 44th floor was quieter than usual on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks out from the worst night the syndicate had seen in a decade. The long table sat 12. Tonight 6 of the chairs were occupied. Guards, senior staff, and at the far end of the table, in the chair that was pulled slightly closer to Aaron's than the others, sat Soren Vale. He wasn't at the edge of the room. He wasn't pressed against a wall. He was at the table. Still quiet, still gentle, still moving through the world in that unhurried way that some people mistake for smallness and others, eventually, understand as something else entirely. His hands were wrapped around a cup of tea. He was listening to Aaron tell a story about something that happened in the courtyard that afternoon. A story that required sound effects and 2 separate impressions of people Soren had never met. And his face held the expression of someone who had forgotten, just for this specific moment, that the world outside this room had sharp edges. Kedron watched him from across the table. Vaylor, beside him, was reading something on a tablet, or pretending to. Aaron reached the climax of his story and threw both arms out for emphasis, and the gesture sent his fork skidding across the table. It stopped in front of Soren. Soren picked it up and handed it back without interrupting the story and without making the boy feel embarrassed about the fork. Kedron filed that away. Then Aaron looked at Soren with the serious expression of someone about to deliver a ruling. "You're my quiet dad," he announced. The table went still for exactly 1 second. Then Vaylor set his tablet down, and he laughed again. The same real, short, unplanned laugh from the medical suite. The kind that doesn't ask permission first. Rajan, at the head of the table, allowed a small curve at the corner of his mouth. The expression lasted about 2 seconds. But it was there. Kedron reached across the table and put his hand over Soren's. Just briefly. Just enough. Soren looked at him. The corners of his eyes did that thing they did when the feeling was too large for his face to contain all of it at once. Aaron was already moving on to the next story. Outside the dining room windows, the Varello district ran its usual current of commerce and movement and quiet violence. The syndicate council member whose name Devlin Ashworth had given up on the rooftop was dealing with the kind of mourning that doesn't end well for people who funded assassination attempts on children. The machinery of the Cauldry's empire was doing what it always did. Efficiently, without announcement, without mercy. But inside this room, right now, none of that was louder than a 7-year-old story about a courtyard and a fork on a table. Power isn't only what you control. Sometimes it's what you choose to build something around. The Syndicate Council was already reacting, already recalibrating, already trying to understand what it meant that the 3 most feared rulers in the Varello district had just permanently placed a mute Omega inside their inner circle. They didn't understand it yet. They would. Because the war for the dynasty's future had not ended on the rooftop. It had started the moment Aaron Cauldrys looked at the man who saved his life and gave him a name that no enemy could ever take back. And if you've made it all the way to this moment in the story, drop a comment below. What part hit you hardest? Was it the basement, the rooftop, or the fork? Your thoughts keep stories like this alive. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Every chapter, every reveal, every moment that makes you stop and feel something real. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if the story moved you, tell us why in the comments. You might just inspire someone else to keep going. The next story is already coming. And it starts in a place no one expected.